I would like, first of all, to thank Michel Pigenet, Nicolas Hatzfeld, and Xavier Vignat and the other organizers for this invitation. They asked me to speak in English. I neither speak English nor French, but I will try the best I can. But I'm afraid I should read a text, and this is not the best way to do things, but it's the only way I could do this. And they also asked me to share with you some ideas and the main results of a team research project at the University of Barcelona on the reconstruction of female labor force participation in Catalonia, but also of similar projects in Europe. So I am not going to speak only about our research, but I will try to give a broader idea of what is going on in counting women's workers in different countries, different teams, different projects. I am aware that this is a rather economic history issue and a rather quantitative methodological approach, but I would try not to do in a quantitative way. So I would share with you some reflection, some methodological reflection on the problems we face when trying to counting women's workers and how could we do that, and the limits also of quantitative approaches. But first, I would like to place these research studies within a broader perspective. So, after the pioneering studies still cited today by Alice Clark and Evie Pimbeck on women's economic position and the role of industrialization in England and Wales, it was not until the end of the 70s that a new interest, this is going his own way. I am not doing nothing but happen. I don't know why, okay. It was not until the end of the 70s that a new interest in this subject re-emerged. Tilly and Scott's, very well known in France, Women's Work and Family in France and in England in 1978, Patricia Branca on different European countries, although by Alice Kessler-Harris, Claudia Goldin, or Kenneth Sokolov in the United States, resumed the analysis of the changes that had taken place in Western women's economic roles since industrialization, and were common ground for feminist movement, women's historians, but also for family, labor, social, and economic historians. During the 80s and 90s, in part due to the lack of reliable aggregate statistics, historians turned to local or regional history in order to analyze the participation of women and labor segregation in certain sectors and occupation-specific industries or companies, and how they were affected by industrialization. This local perspective allowed to access to a greater multiplicity of both quantitative and qualitative sources to gather new evidences about the female participation in the labor market, allowing more complex analysis in which relations could be established between paid and unpaid work, labor, family and marriage, labor and fertility, for example, or between labor and institution and cultural and community traditions. The new quantitative but also qualitative evidences collected by these studies demonstrated, among other things, that some of the classical theories on female labor could be the result of under-enumeration of the national population censuses on which the initial studies of the evolution of female labor during industrialization has been based. There have been also serious difficulties to find aggregate data in pre-census period. In 1995, Pamela Sharp already declared this. Attempts to consider the amount of work, type of work, and the sexual division of labor in the Industrial Revolution founded on this problem of lack of information regarding the early modern period. More recently, Anna Belavitis, in her book Il lavoro delle donne nelle città dell'Europa moderna, claimed that the persistence of under-registration of female participation in quantitative sources, either in early modern as in the last 2 centuries, led historians to use qualitative sources. So in recent decades, the digitization of numerous historical sources, including the national population censuses and the enumerator books, but also many others such as civil register, household budgets, institutional records, or by either public and private archives and institutions, together with the new possibilities offered by the increasing sophisticated quantitative methods, have offered a new opportunity to the attempts to substantiate the evolution of women's participation in labor markets on sounder and broader quantitative basis. New national and international research projects, international seminars, new books, special issues in the main economic, social, and humanities journals nowadays demonstrate the recent dynamism of these studies in this field. Here. These that you can see in this slide are just some examples of the various prestigious journals that have devoted some of their special issues to this matter recently. As this sample of journals shows, in these last years, the quantification of female labor didn't just attract the attention of economic history, but also of historical demography, family history, feminist economic, social history, labor history, because some of the current debates in each of these disciplines are still open due to the lack of reliable female labor participation rates. However, over the last 30 years, certain points of consensus have also been reached, of which I will only mention the most relevant. First, although recently the criticism made of some population censuses, such as the one in 1851 in England and France, are being reconsidered and qualified, there is a fairly general consensus that they undercount agrarian women's work, paid and unpaid work in domestic industries, as well as unpaid work of women in family workshops. It also seems that early censuses in England and Wales overestimate domestic servants, the opposite that happened in 19th and 20th century censuses, as Raffaella Sarti has shown for Italy. Although it has been assumed that women's factory work was accurately recorded, almost, at least in England and France, some historians are saying that. In our research, in our Spanish, in our Catalan research, have shown that under-registration was as high for women in factory work as for those in other occupations. The second important question is that in some cases, this under-enumeration affected the published census reports rather than the data in the original household schedules, as seemed to happen in Victorian censuses, for example. And in this case, it might easily be adjusted for when considering the original manuscript returns. In other cases, it also affects the enumerator books, which made necessary to resort to other sources, quantitative or not, and other methods to reconstruct female participation. There are numerous complex reasons for this under-enumeration. In some cases, because their objective was military or fiscal, and therefore they only recorded the occupation of the household head. In others, because only full-time formal male labor was registered, while women occupation was more often informal, irregular, or part-time. Or because the registered occupation identified the status of the worker, but not necessarily the actual employment. Or because only included the main occupation and not pluriactivity or second occupation, it being considered that for women this was always unpaid work, domestic work. In many countries, like for example in Spain, the census agents had the explicit order only to include the activity of wives if it was different from that carried out by their husbands. Unmarried women's work was less well enumerated, and this is something that is happening in all the countries. And this makes us conscious that have introduced bias into the classical hypothesis on the relation between activity and life cycle, and consequently also into the determinants of female activity, favoring interpretation in terms of supply rather than demand, and also oversizing the scale of the male breadwinner model in different countries. In some countries, under-enumeration also increased during the second half of the 19th century. And if this is so, it might have affected the analysis of activity trends and other related problems addressed by economic historians. In short, census construct the working occupation, the working population, as much as they count it. Enumerated books are not useless, but they do not provide ready-to-use data, so reliability of these sources cannot be taken for granted, and contrast with other sources, quantitative or qualitative, is essential for us. We have also, I would like to mention two general issues of consensus on the results of these European researchers, with a strong implication in methodologies and future research agenda. First, the consensus on the diversity of women's experiences, which implies that any simple, aggregate, national narrative about women's work during the Industrial Revolution is likely to be seriously misleading. This led us to define local and regional studies and quantification as a more appropriate method to reconstruct the female activity rate. Second, the size of the under-enumeration of female work on national population censuses, although with some exceptions, it's often much higher than had been thought and defended by some economic and social historians so far. So that means that the interpretation of economic and social change would be modified if we take women's labor into account. In fact, as I will mention, new countings are changing the chronology and the geography of a structural change in Europe, but also the model of the family economy functioning, in particular the scope of the economy of the male breadwinner and living standard. However, despite the abundant research undertaken over the last few years, economic historians still disagree about the nature of trends, the role of women's work in economic development, structural change and productivity, and indeed the nature of economic development during the Industrial Revolution as a whole. Labor economics, demographers and family historians disagree about the determinants of women's labor and the relationship between the female labor force participation rate, family systems, for example, European marriage, and fertility. The extent of male breadwinner and the family wage continues to be a matter of discussion for gender and labor historians, whether social or cultural, as are the interpretation of protective legislation and trade unions politics regarding female activity. So there is not only an economic problem or an issue for economic historians. the roots of the social construction of masculine and feminine identity for cultural historians, for example, are rather based on an impressionistic idea of women participation in the labor market. So what I want to do next is to show you, to take some of these issues to show you how the new ways of counting women's workers are changing the narratives in different countries, contributing to a more complex picture and a better understanding of historical processes. They are obviously very complex problems, but the full scope and depth of which I am not going to be able to do it with here. This is the only slide with numbers. So I will begin by taking some examples of the renewal of the classical debates between optimistic and pessimistic view on the impact on the industrialization of women's works and life in England. Sonia Rose, a fundamental benchmark for social and gender historians, indicated that for the debate, the problem was precisely, and I quote, the lack of quantitative data from pre-modern and modern history, which in her view is behind the optimistic view on women's role in the process of industrialization. The recent development of studies on the modern era has indeed strengthened pessimistic theories, but has changed also the classical chronology. In 1995, using family budgets instead of population censuses, Sarah Harrell and Jane Humphreys offered new data on women's work and wages that corroborated Alice Clark hypothesis about the loss of employment opportunities, which they attributed to the reduction in agriculture work and the mechanization of textiles, among other reasons. This downturn was so important, according to them, that even where women's wage contribution to the family economies increased due to the reduction of wage differential, the contribution of women to family economies supposed to be declined, because the number of families in which women had an occupation diminished from the mid-19th century. The pessimistic view, defended by Jane and Sarah Harrell, has also received support from qualitative approaches, since beyond the supposed reduction in activity rates, according to social and gender historians, in the formation of the new labor markets, women were relegated to marginal, non-skilled, and badly paid jobs. This is defended also by Sonia Rose or Alice Clark in her book on Looking for Bridges. However, in the last 20 years, certain number of studies based on local sources are questioning this as a general model, while highlighting the important differences in patterns of female employment and trends over time. The new project, for example, for the Cambridge Group of Population, led by Shaw Taylor, indicates that in 1851, female labor force participation rates ranges for a low 70% in Easton District to a high of 78% in the hat-making districts in Bedfordshire. The data show that in many areas of England, the participation of women in the labor market increased instead of declining, or remained stable at least, from the end of the 18th century without the reduction in the second half of the 19th century, which was considered to be the general trend until now. This is also the case, for example, of the potteries area in the north, studied by Christine Dupré, on the textile manufacture also in Lancashire or in Hertfordshire, where straw plate and hat trade, studied by Nigel Goose, employed a large number of women. In most of these areas, the demand of female labor was so intense that their work was never always affected by the life cycle of the husband's income. These results are also questioning the idea that the dissemination of the male breadwinner model was early among the working classes, an idea that was based on the official aggregate data of national population censuses. As Humphreys recently argued, revision of these female labor force participation rates also alter our very understanding of economic development and industrialization. This is not new. It was also pointed out almost 30 years ago by Maxim Berg. Berg wondered whether the idea of the low productivity of the English economy in the crucial years of the Industrial Revolution could be the result of leaving aside the sector which mainly employed female labor. She also wondered whether this hypothesis would be altered on taking into account women's work and the sectors with a majority of female labor. Berg pointed out that if we take female agricultural work into account, the reduction in assets in the primary sector was greater than we thought. In fact, the new countings made by Richard Wall, by Hicks, Verdon, or Burnett on rural women's work is now more than doubling, multiplied by 2, figures of the National Census of Population. Moreover, the predominant labor in the new industries in the 18th and 19th century was female, and it was women to a greater extent than men who were employed in the most dynamic sectors with more technological and organizational innovation and with greater added value. And this is, we do not know yet whether the productivity of these sectors was due just to the low salaries of women or to the new system of labor organization, technological innovation, and technical capacity of women. But if the latter were the reasons, we would be closer to the traditional view of industrialization as an industrial revolution. Berg encouraged progress in the reconstruction of female activity rates in order to answer this fundamental question of economic history. And this is what the Cambridge Group is doing now for the last 14 years, collecting new data on men and women's employment over the whole 580 to 1911 time period, which results that are changing the picture of the occupational structure and chronology. I would like now to address how the new countings of women workers are changing the understanding of the Dutch and Spanish experience. And I move to our research. That according to the classical studies have had very low rates of female activity compared with other countries in the respective areas. In the Netherlands, this tradition of supposed low female activity rates was already dominant in the 17th century, excluding women from performing market work outside agriculture, labor, and domestic service. The economic prosperity and the early separation of industrial activities from the homestead would have stimulated the diffusion of the middle class ideal of domesticity, according to Potbutter research. However, recent studies by a team of economic and social labor historians like Elise van der Nerven, Van Zandem, Lucassen, Botter, and others pointed out that this thesis was supported in very weak evidences. The research project on the Dutch economy gathered new and more reliable data on female labor force participation rates for the period 1600 to 1900, revisiting this theory. First of all, the new data on the participation of women in the Dutch economy in pre-industrial times show that the very minimum female rate activity in the early modern Dutch towns around 1600 was probably between 40 and 50% instead of 20%, which had been previously considered. And this is something in which other historians like Van Poppel or Marco van Leeuwen are also in agreement. The important thing is that these new data have questioned the pessimistic view on the impact of industrialization on women's employment opportunities. and they give a reason to inverse the hypothesis of the relationship between pre-industrial economic development and the economic role of women. The economic prosperity in the Dutch Republic did not lead to the retreat of women from the labor market, but rather the contrary. Women contributed to an increase in income and economic success by participating in the labor market in such large numbers. Compared to the 19th century rates, labor force participation rates of Dutch women were in fact rather high in the pre-industrial period, both in the densely populated and highly urbanized province of Holland and in proto-industrial areas such as Tilburg in the rural south. Although most authors have indicated that in the second part of the 19th century there was an actual decline in the active female population at national level, in the last decade of the 19th century, the female labor force participation of married women in Netherlands reached 30%, which is, in any case, is higher than of other countries and more than recorded on the census for the same year, according to which it was only 10%. Like in the case of Holland, Spain was considered, and is still be considered, to be a country with very low female activity rates, which did not reach levels above 15% until after the Civil War. The studies on the participation of women in the Spanish labor market has been based on the data published by national population censuses starting in 1860. Although his under-registration was not unknown, it was not thought that his size could be significant. These data were used as proof of the theory of the backwardness of Spanish economy, Spanish culture, Spanish social organization, and Spanish women's identities. This supposed delay was attributed to a series of factors, including the persistence of the agriculture-based economy with supposed scarce female participation, and the failure of the Industrial Revolution, incapable of solving the excess agricultural labor and the influence of Catholicism and of political conservatism in gender models in Spain. But regional and local recent studies, as us, but not only us, have shown that national scale is not appropriate for the analysis of structural change. There is not a Spanish economic model, but different paths to industrialization. The under-registration of female labor in the national census of population has hidden this Spanish diversity and created a false image of a model of development based on a tradition of low female activity rates from the ancient regime to the 20th century. The classical idea about the Spanish economy sustains that the majority of the population was employed in primary sector until the 20th century. This idea was based only on the counting of male occupations, but as women and men were concentrating in different occupational sectors, calculating the structure of the occupation only with data from adult men produces deeply biased results, and especially a significant loss of workers in manufacturing and services, where women and girls were concentrated. The use of sources that provide information on the occupation of women and children has led to review the idea of the Spanish economy as fundamental rural and industry are residual in the 18th century. On the contrary, manufactures were much more widespread than suggested by the structure of occupation usually used. But this manufacturing intensity declined effectively in the first half of the 19th century. The development of the Catalan cotton industry represented the collapse of other region textile manufacturers. In short, if we take women's work into account, In the whole of Castilla, for example, a study by Carmen Sarasua, there was no less industrial workers in the 18th century than in the 19th century, but the opposite. The most recent studies by contemporary Spanish historians on the role of women in the industrialization process are also questioning the low rates of female activity registered in the national population censuses and the municipal list since the mid-19th century on. These studies, aided by historical demographers, economic historians, labor and gender historians like Luisa Muñoz for Galicia or Pilar Pérez Fuentes for the Basque Country, or our own studies for Catalonia, reveal very high female activity rates at the beginning of the 19th century and no sign of decline during the 19th century, nor on the first third of the 20th century, and in some cases until the Civil War. In these three cases, Galicia, el País Vasco, y Cataluña, the Golding's U-shaped curve theory is not corroborated. In Catalonia and Galicia, women were the preferential workforce in the leading sector. This is textile and fish canning. On the contrary, in the Vizcayan industrialization, women had no access to the iron and mining leading sectors, but they support his development through agriculture, lodging, and different kind of service labor. In pre-industrial Galicia, this is a photograph of canning industry in Galicia, the canning and transformation of fishing were carried out manually by women, while men were engaged in fishing. This sexual division of labor remains in the industrial states, and this is a photograph for these states. The location of canning companies on the coast of Spain and Portugal in the last decades of the 19th century increased seasonal employment opportunities for thousands of women. In the Canaries, female activity rates reached 80%. Women also perform other auxiliary tasks in the fishing sectors. In this composition of the labor force remained unchanged through the first third of the 20th century, driven by the high demand for female labor, the instability of men's work in fishing, and their low wages. As for the Basque industrialization, data on population censuses reflect a low female labor force participation rate at the mid-19th century and a strong decline until the beginning of the 20th century. But new data provided by Pilar Pérez Fuentes for Vizcaya has revealed a myriad of female occupation in the paid and unpaid work. This is for Galicia, also in a factory, and this is also for Galicia as well. Excuse me. And this is for the Basque Country. Has revealed a myriad of female occupation in the paid and unpaid work in family farms, fishing, and canning, lodging for immigrants, artisan workshops, domestic service, but also in very physical demand works like, for example, ship cargo and and dock labor, which is not usually visible in the national census of population. Confronted with other alternative sources, under-registration in the population censuses in Basque Country reached 70% of the female participation in 1877 and a minimum of 50% of under-registration in 1900. This data challenged the official statistic picture of a male breadwinner family model in Spain that late in 19th century. In fact, the reconstruction of family budgets done by Pilar Pérez Fuentes show that without the unaccounted income generated by women, the survival on many households would have been simply impossible. As for the Catalan case, I would like very briefly comment on three aspects and not quantitative. First, according to the National Census of Population, female labor for the province of Barcelona stood at between 10 and 20%. Between 860 and 930s. but our new data pointed out a high local diversity within the Barcelona province. In the textile industry areas, the female labor force participation rates ranges from 40% to 80%. Women played a decisive role in Catalan proto-industrialization, but the cotton industry, the leader of Catalan industrialization, based also his growth on the large-scale employment of women and girls and the feminization of the sector from the mid-19th century onwards. These opportunities explain the continuity on women's high activity rates in textile municipalities in the long term, underlying the importance of demand condition. So, where market opportunities offer satisfactory jobs, women responded positively, calling into question neoclassical theories of women's paid labor supply. Our results confirm those in Galicia and the País Vasco, and it is that the breadwinner model had little relevance among the working classes in Spain during industrialization of these three regions. The second aspect I would like to highlight is that these high rates of female activity happen both in areas of low male wages as in areas with high male wages that were in principle sufficient to support the whole family. Likewise, the relationship between the husband's salary and the women's occupation is not linear in the areas we have studied, but probably not in others in the rest of Spain. This indicates that the economic factor is probably not sufficient to explain the supply of female labor, and that cultural factors had a significant impact that we have to take into account. Third point, and I finish, according to Hagnall hypothesis, but also Jean de Vries hypothesis, and more recently the Moore and Van Thanden European marriage model and nuclear family position the North countries on the path to modern economic growth. We do not attempt to challenge this thesis, but the idea that only this type of family could stimulate economic development. This was the case of Catalonia, the first industrialized region in Spain, where the STEM family predominated. Unlike what has been indicated for the regions of the northern of Europe, this model does not appear to have been a break, but rather a level for the economic development. Yet, our hypothesis for the Catalan case is that this predominance of the STEM family allow young wives to stay in the labor market thanks to the role played by older women, relatives in ascending or collateral lines, in looking after the children and the household. In these areas with a long proto-industrial tradition, families had been operating for a long time, like cooperative economies, which drew upon the work of all the household members. The introduction of new industries generated high demand for female labor, which could be met with great flexibility due to the family forms and secular tradition. And so this led us also to question the idea of the dichotomy between women that work and women that do not work in families, because is this circulation of domestic work between women that allow some of them in certain periods of the life cycle to be in the labor market. And so we cannot also consider that the old women that do not work are because they belong to the older generation, traditional women, traditional identities, because they are supporting the work of the daughters. And so we need more complex interpretation of female identities, the place of labor in the female identities, within the family between different generations. These differences at national as well as regional or local levels in the trends of female labor participation in Spain give support to Beneria and Sen criticism of Boserup general theory on the relation between female participation and development. As recent research shows, explanation of women's participation do not appear to be universal, but rather particular to social cultural contexts, whether national, regional, or local. And I would like to finish with no conclusion, but some final reflection. So making greater progress in these debates not only depends on counting women's workers, we also need to go beyond numbers to capture the complexity of the female and male and child labor experience. We need qualitative as much as quantitative evidence, and also we need qualitative analysis of quantitative sources before taking data for granted. This is also why we need interdisciplinarity and cooperation between economic, social, and cultural history, as well as with other disciplines. All these new efforts to gather new quantitative evidence on female labor force participation are changing women's history, gender history, but also labor history. Moreover, the inclusion in different fields of historical research is changing also our very understanding of economic development, social and cultural labor history, and the role of women in those changes. North and South of Europe did not follow the same path to industrialization, nor the same models of development, and we have to be sensitive to this. But we need interdisciplinary approaches and long-term analysis to better understand these differences. Gender and women's historians have contributed to a better understanding of the social, political, and cultural dimension which influence the participation of women in the labor market, and thus the relationship between gender models and the making of the working class and the labor market. However, in many cases, this model clash with women's need to work, as male salaries took a long time to reach a family wage. The quantification is important, but not sufficient. We do not yet have sufficient studies to know whether the women who work did so out of a strict need, as the preferred option, or as part of a traditional culture, or even as a culture of resistance to the middle-class models. This requires research to be designed which improves the relationship between quantitative and qualitative methods and a better alignment of economic, social, and cultural aspects. Thank you.